Our second roundtable today, the global impact of U.S.-China cooperation and competition, will be moderated by Mr. Charles Freeman. Mr. Freeman is a former assistant U.S. trade representative and an expert on the topic at hand. Additionally, Mr. Freeman hails from a family of renowned China experts. So take it away, Mr. Freeman.
Thank you very much, Angie. It's a genuine honor to be here at the Committee of 100's annual conference, and I want to thank Mercy and others that invited me to be here. We've got a great panel to talk about an important issue in front of us, and I know that one that concerns the committee very much. I won't read their bios. You've got them, and if you have them, you're as in awe of them as am I. Ambassador James Sasser, former ambassador, U.S. ambassador to China, former senator from the great state of Tennessee. Sharif Khan, who is the head of Hire North America, has been with that company since 1999 and has a long history in retail and understanding exactly what people who actually are affected most by trade, the consumers, are. Ambassador Carla Hills, many of you know Ambassador Hills. She is a leading light in U.S.-China relations and has been for longer than she'd probably care to admit. But she was in her government post, the USTR, and Undersecretary Bob Hormats, who is responsible for economic affairs at the State Department and is on the front lines of negotiations with the Chinese government on many of the issues that we're going to cover in the panel. Just to set the stage a little bit before I ask Ambassador Sasser to speak, trade was, for much of U.S.-China relations or modern U.S.-China relations, was the real positive. It was the real driving force, and frankly, if you look at the political and structural dimensions of the economic and trade relationship, trade really was something that particularly the U.S. business community was so behind that it drove the relationship in ways that allowed the two sides to have a very even footing. It was a real win-win story. As that trade has expanded and grown more complex, there have been some challenges in that relationship. As the Chinese economy has itself expanded and grown, there have been some interesting developments in terms of Chinese companies looking out. On the structural side, we've seen, for most of the relationship, a tremendous complementarity between the two sides, and tremendous opportunities for growth for Chinese companies in the United States and U.S. companies in China. But as the structures have evolved, there are also some challenges. You hear a lot, particularly in the wake of the 2008 financial crisis, about the Chinese model versus the market model. And the question we have is whether the two sides truly are as complementary, are as compatible as they once were. There are a lot of questions, and all of this takes place against a backdrop of dynamic changes in both economies, and particularly in the Chinese economy, where the old model of reliance on exports and investment to drive growth is waning, and a demand for consumption, particularly Chinese consumption, is on the increase. So this is a very much something with a lot of moving parts. And I want to turn to people that know a lot about those moving parts, first with Ambassador Jim Sasser.
Well, thank you very much, Charles. You're absolutely right. Historically, the American business community, for over 30 years, has been a champion and the principal defender of the Sino-American relationship. The American business community and the economic relationship between the two countries has been enormously important and has been the glue many times that have held Sino-U.S. relations on an even keel, or returned it to an even keel when it was knocked off course by some untoward event. For many years, the American business community, particularly multinational corporations, were the driving force in the U.S. Congress to moderate some of the more off-the-wall sort of resolutions that would move through Congress, damaging Sino-U.S. relations. The most favored nation concept, year after year when it came up for renewal, the American business community was there pushing it through, and without the force of the economics and without the drive of the business community, I don't think most favored nation status for China would have been renewed year after year. And then when I accompanied Premier Zhu Rengji when he came to the U.S. In 1999 and began negotiating and got just to the cusp of the WTO agreement. And that would not have occurred later on without the pressure of the American business community. I well remember that we were negotiating that China's entry into WTO, and we got right to the edge and couldn't push it over. And then there was a leak from the U.S. Trade Negotiator's Office. Perhaps it was done intentionally, I don't know. But anyway, the negotiations ended up in the Wall Street Journal. And I well remember that all of a sudden the business community was all over the Clinton administration, pushing vigorously, saying, go ahead and get this done. And we were in New York with Premier Zhu when President Clinton called him and said, look, let's go ahead and get it done before you leave the country. And Premier Zhu said, well, we can't do it, but you send somebody to China and we'll get it done then. And that's how we came to come to the WTO agreement, and it was a result of the pressure from the American business community. I well remember that also during that period, from 1996 through almost 2000, when I was in China as ambassador, when an American CEO would come to China, they were given royal treatment, and they would meet with the Chinese leadership, with Premier Zhu, with Jiang Zemin, and they were really given probably better treatment than many of our congressmen who were coming at that time. And also Alan Greenspan and Bob Rubin, who was then the Secretary of the Treasury, they were also given the royal treatment when they came to China and seemed to be even more respected than American secretaries of state by the Chinese leadership during that period. Now, there's been a decline, or sense of disappointment, I think, on the part of American business recently in their relationships with the Chinese economy and with the Chinese leadership to some extent. They're complaining about the playing field is no longer balanced. American businesses are complaining about that. They're saying that that as a result of indigenous innovation, they're having to give away so many of their trade secrets. They're concerned about what they perceive to be cyber snooping to gain some of their commercial trade secrets on the part of the Chinese, complaining about regulations being so complex they can't understand them, complaining about state-owned enterprises getting all of the breaks, and they're having very great difficulty competing with the state-owned enterprises. But even after all of those complaints, I was looking at some statistics just the other day. You find that American companies in China, even though they will say that they're having great troubles, 47% of them say in 2013 that IPR enforcement has improved. 30 and 25% say it's the same, and only 9% say it's gotten worse. 37% of American companies say that they have to transfer technology in order to gain market access in China. That's up from 27%, up a 10% rise in 2 years. But even with all of that, when you ask them how they're doing in China, 9% say their Chinese operations are very profitable. 65% say they're profitable. This was in 2003. In 2013, 10 years later, 9% of the U.S. companies still say they're very profitable. 68% say they're profitable. So there's a lot of complaints and a lot of turmoil, but still I think overall American companies feel like they're doing pretty well in China. And so that economic glue between the two countries, I think, continues to hold us together as we become more mutually interdependent economically, even though we get into trouble sometimes on a strategic level or in foreign relations, policy questions and things like that. Well, I'm not going to go on because I've gone on too long already. So
that was terrific, Jim. Carl, I'll turn it to you.
Thank you very much, Charles. Well, it's a pleasure to join the Committee of 100 and particularly to be part of this distinguished panel. I think leaders on both sides of the Pacific have regularly said, whether they'd be Democrat or Republican, that we want the relationship to be positive, constructive, and cooperative. Indeed, when President Xi Jinping was here last year, he said the economic relationship was the ballast and the propeller for the overall relationship. It would hold it, keep it on a steady course. And there's no question that the bilateral relationship is robust. U.S. is China's second largest export market, behind the European Union taken as a whole. China is the U.S. Third largest market, behind Mexico and Canada. Actually, I should say Canada and Mexico. Canada's our largest. And since China joined the World Trade Organization in 2001, U.S. exports are up 500%. So that is a very happy economic picture. Our investments in China and margin, as Ambassador Sasser has said, are doing well. And going forward, however, I think we could do even better. And that is because our economies are highly complementary. China is going through an urbanization period that is more massive than anything in human history. And it needs technology, management skills, and the like. The United States is a highly industrialized country. It is skillful at high technology, at supply chain management, and the sorts of things that make globalization work. So we really are the right and left hand as the first and second largest economies and should be working very closely together. So what are the challenges? Let me just mention three briefly. One is the fragile economic global circumstance. It is inevitable that when you have tough economic times, that stokes economic nationalism and increases pressure to protect the domestic market. And trade has been constrained not only by the European debt crisis and the national disasters in Thailand and in Japan that broke into the supply chains and the difficulties in the Arab world. Trade has been constrained by protectionist measures that countries have imposed, often to try to get around the WTO rules that we have all agreed to. And although the leaders of the G20 have regularly pledged at every single meeting that they will not tolerate protectionism, and if there have been protectionist measures put into place, they will abolish them. In fact, that has not occurred. The World Trade Organization did a report last fall that said actually the G20, which represent the 20 largest economies in the world, have imposed protectionist measures that are adversely affecting not only our bilateral trade, but global trade. And it's accurate to say that both China and the United States have been part of this counterproductive trend. Secondly is the trust deficit. You heard about that earlier this morning from the ambassador. You heard about it in the first panel. The trade deficit is fed by economic friction. And the polls show that there is a deep distrust on both sides. It's already been mentioned that Chinese think that the United States is trying to prevent it from its reemergence as a global leader. And Americans think that Chinese are trying to steal its economic technology, and to dislodge it as a leader. And you have that friction there. And the ambassador has mentioned the surveys. I read the most recent one that came out 2 weeks ago from the American Chamber of Commerce. And one fact stood out to me, and that was that there was a 35% decline in the 325 companies that responded, saying that they thought that the investment environment in China had improved. 35% fewer thought it had improved than in 2012. And a majority of those responding to this said that they didn't think it was going to get any better in 2014. And that's a big, big concern, not only for the fact that underwrites this, but because, as Jim has pointed out, it's the business community that has been the ballast and the propeller to keeping the relationship on a steady and positive and forward-moving course. The business community came to the fore on China's emergence into the World Trade Organization. And finally, there is the knowledge gap. I think it's a concern that Americans know so little about China's culture, history, and how China affects the global economy. I think too few Chinese recognize that what Americans complain about, particularly in the business sector, whether it be licensing, the speed with which they can have a branch, the equity caps on more than 100 sectors, the protection of intellectual property. The fact is, if China were to move forward on that, that would not be a gift so much to the United States as to advance China's forward motion, moving up the economic scale and encouraging its own inventors and making progress. So we have a knowledge gap on both sides. And so what is the remedy? I strongly believe that we need more face-to-face meetings of our top leadership. We have the Strategic and Economic Dialogue. It meets once a year, and will meet in July for the 5th meeting. But once a year, with 1 day on strategic issues and 1 day on economic issues, in my view, is not sufficient to create either the relationships or to create the understanding of the issues. When it started, it was called the Strategic Economic Dialogue, and it met twice a year, 2 days at each occasion on economic issues, for a total of 4 days on economic issues. And even then, I thought we could use more. I would also recommend that they be smaller. We went to Beijing in May of last year for the 4th Strategic Economic Dialogue and took 200. The Chinese, of course, fielded 200 back. With 400, I mean, we don't have 400 in this auditorium, but it's tough to build a relationship with when you have 400 in the room. I'd like to go back to the time when there were 8 to 10 in the room, 8 to 10 talking about what really was a concern and what were the issues that joined us and how could we move forward on those. So I think expanding the frequency would be helpful. And I think we need to avoid zero-sum debates. We need to look for win-win situations. For example, China wants to have investment and indigenous development for good reason. And the Americans want to be able to bring in their technology and have it be safe. Well, China issued more patents last year than many other Western countries. And I think just having a really effective intellectual property protection would benefit the inventors in China and encourage investment in China by outsiders that already hold patents. Secondly, I think that the investors in our respective countries want equal treatment. China complains that when they come to this country, it is confusing, and they feel that sometimes the rules are unfair. We echo the same thing when we go to their country. We need a bilateral investment treaty. Transparency. The Chinese complain about corruption. In fact, it is one of the leadership's key objectives. We complain about lack of transparency of rules. If every rule governing business was published for 30 days, whether it be local, provincial, or central, so that the business leaders knew what the rules were, whether they were Chinese leaders or U.S. leaders, we would know where there were deviations. It would tend to curtail corruption, and it would provide a transparency that both sides want. So I think the private sector, business, groups like the Committee of 100, all can speak to these issues, not in an adversarial tone, but rather in what we can do together. And I think there's a whole lot we can do.
Thanks, Carla. That's excellent summation. If I can digress for a second before I turn it over to Mr. Khan, and I completely agree with you on the need for more robust and more intimate government-to-government dialogue. I recall I work for PepsiCo now. I recall when I was at USTR that in one of the first meetings I had with my counterpart from the Chinese side, and I went in to the Chinese side with a long list of demands from American companies, all of whom remained nameless, for a variety of concessions from the Chinese side. And my counterpart turned to me at the end of the session, pulled me aside and said, someday your companies will have to have a direct relationship with our government. Someday your companies will actually have to understand that they need to be adopted by the Chinese society, by the Chinese government, and by the Chinese people. And certainly I think for an iconic brand and an iconic set of brands like PepsiCo, that's been a real challenge. How do we become part of the fabric of the Chinese economy in a way that allows us to present our challenges? And I know Mr. Khan represents High America, which is one of the singularly most successful Chinese brands and Chinese companies in the United States. And I wonder if you can talk about that, as how do you, as a company, develop to become part of the fabric of the U.S. society?
Thank you, Mr. Freeman. And thank you all for attending this Committee 100 conference. When I received the invitation and I saw the theme, Common Ground, and I was wondering, what common ground that me personally, a private citizen, from a humble business perspective, that I can offer at this forum. Obviously, with Mr. Freeman's assistance, and I learned what my role is, and I heard what Mr. Sasser, Ambassador Sasser, and Ambassador Hills has to talk about. I realized, first of all, audience, thank you for having me here. I don't have the altitude nor the latitude which they possess. But from a business perspective, the first thing I would like to take this opportunity to encourage that we encourage localization. Hire came to the country back in 1999. One of our themes, how we drive our business, was localization. We say, go local. We do not say, and we did not say, go global. So about 15 years later, I can tell you we sold in this market roughly 50 million units of product, either bearing Haier's brand or bearing some domestic brands which you're familiar with. Out of the 50 million units, at least 95% of them were under the Haier brand. Now, how do we bring a foreign brand into the country, into the United States? First and foremost, we're thankful to the United States of America having an open market to begin with. Everybody can come in and give your best and earn your opportunity. This is how we did, how we have done. Back in 1999, we decided to go local. One of the first things we decided to do is to open up a factory in South Carolina. We were the first. In 2001, we received community award from Kershaw County of South Carolina. In 2002, we received the contributing award recognition from the state of South Carolina. Ever since then, Lenovo and other Chinese companies follow Haier's footstep, making investment in the United States of America, open up factories, open up R&D centers. Our next step will be continuing our momentum in South Carolina, and we already underway starting our R&D center in South Carolina. Is that all we did? No, that's not all we did. We participate actively in industry associations and work with the regulatory agencies in terms of setting the standards for the products and for the services, be it from a safety standpoint or from international harmonization standpoint. So we engage in these activities. Now, coming back to the small world of our businesses, today we employ 250 people from a sales, marketing, and service standpoint. We employ another 160 from a factory manufacturing standpoint. We have 100 people in the after-sales service, and we have hundreds of service providers from end-to-end supply chain standpoint that collaborate and work with us. I can tell you more than 90% of the people are Americans. So my first suggestion for the policymakers and for the leader in the Committee 100, that's do the things that encourage localization, because over time there is me in you and there's you in me. We're very close with one another. The second suggestion I have for consideration is to emphasize common interests, like what we have here, common ground. There are things, there's no national boundary. There's no understanding differences. Since 1999, we dedicated ourselves on national treasure as well as the preservation of natural resources. We team up with National Parks Conservation Association. We also engage in the community events. We participate with Food Bank of New York. Now, none of these are Chinese organizations. These are American and local organizations. So from a product perspective, from a business perspective, or simply being part of a good citizen of a community, businesses, we know what we can do, we know our capability, and we know our limitations, and we respond. This is a common interest that require nobody to push. It's voluntarily. So when I made mention about we participate with Food Bank of New York, Actually, within our company, of the 250 people, we have a group of people. It's on voluntary basis. They are called hire volunteers. They are called hire volunteers. And they get engaged with the community event, either with the sponsorship of the company or without the sponsorship of the company. How a brand, how a business can be accepted and over time built in America. We all know Ambassador Hills just made mention about America, way more advanced from technology, from the infrastructure, from in very many areas. So we understand we need to be responsive to the consumers. From day one, when we come in, we decide to be local, we already identify our company. Our company is not going to be an exporter. Our company is not going to be an importer. Our company is not going to be just a trading company. We want to be a full-service company. So we need to understand the consumers. In the process, through the collective efforts, Americans, Chinese, whatnot, there have been 4 years in a row, from 2008 to 2011. I believe every one of you can relate to the publication by the name of Consumer Report.
Yes.
4 years in a row, and I believe, based on my short history, it's the only company who has a product got rated the most energy efficient and the best buy for the consumer. In those comments, in those statements, in those recognitions, there's no national boundary. At the same time, in China, back in year 2000, EPA, our environmental protection agency, gave to our parent company, Hire China, an award on the energy efficiency. So there are a whole host of things that we participate. Again, from a business standpoint, you don't know where the opportunity resides. Ambassador Sasser talking about how Wall Street, the news get leaked out or whatnot. We have had similar experience as well. Sometimes in the public, under the public eyes, it's hard to maneuver. I think right before or during the economic situation which we were confronted back in 2009, there were newspapers talking about there are a few possible acquirer of General Electric appliances. We're in the appliance business. We were taught about. I know for a fact very many of the article were not true. I don't know how it came about, but under the radar, which nobody knows about, and even until today, there are extremely few report or exposures about this, which I can share with everybody. In 2009, Hire and GE did not agree to buy one another, but Hire and General Electric agreed to work together. Within 6 months after the agreement was executed, Hire became the distributor for General Electric appliances in China. So in 6 months, General Electric's appliances are entering into 70,000 villages in China. It's a win-win situation. It's a win-win situation. Next, I would suggest business, of course, has real challenges. And my suggestion for the policymaker and the leaders in attendance here is let's do something, and perhaps you have an influence. Let's do something to ease the real challenges the business faces. So, of course, there are a lot, but I think from when we talked about U.S. and China bilateral trade standpoint, there are 3 areas I feel it's hard, even taking the higher approach localize its global operation, it's still hard to navigate. First, regulatory rules. In our product area, we're subject to more than 1,000 different standards, and they are changing. I'm not suggesting we shouldn't change the standards. We should always raise the standards, but work with the businesses to deliver the standards that meeting the times. Secondly, IP, intellectual property. We should have intellectual property protection and respect that. But look, as you become larger, I definitely feel it. There are patent trolls really follow you at every step of the way. They don't create any economy or productivity, but they go after you. Third, tax and tariff. Here are strictly governmental political. When you change your rules, for the most part, the one who worked hard 10 years, 15 years are subject to the risk of the change. So I suggest our policy leaders look at these areas. Before I close, I know I spoke too much. Before I close, I would suggest time has changed. From the first industrial revolution to the computer revolution, which bring about the power to the retail establishments. You see the malls that's being created and whatnot. To today, digital revolution. The power is shifting to the consumers. When the power is shifting to the consumers, the conventional thinking of national sovereignty as well as country-centric boundaries really disappearing. We are in this digital revolution. We like it or we don't like it. It's plenty of opportunities. So my suggestion for the policy leaders is to lead in this unprecedented opportunities so we can create an ecosystem that's not just bilateral, but multilateral. We're all global citizens. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Koh. Bob.
Well, thanks, Charles, and it's very good to be here with the Committee of 100. It's a very influential group and a group that really knows China quite well. So we've heard some very, very thoughtful observations from my co-panelists, and let me try to offer a few thoughts that in many ways complement what they have said. Let me just start out by underscoring a point that Jim Sasser made right at the outset. I had the opportunity of visiting China very early on in the normalization process because I worked for Henry Kissinger, and we went to China during a period when there was literally no trade, zero trade between our two countries. And in fact, the first memo that he asked me to write, since I was his economic advisor at the time, was on a variety of aspects of the economic relationship. One element was, as we develop our political relationship, and it was really the political relationship which led in building the relationship. This was really a product of the Cold War, China competing with the Soviet Union, the U.S. Working with China to create a greater degree of balance, and then discussions of how we can end the Vietnam War. It was a wholly different environment, but the politics led the process, and it was largely Cold War politics or Cold War derived politics, where we were working with China in sort of parallel ways. The Cold War is over, and that period is over, and the political environment at that point was, as I say, the driving force. And in the memo, he said, tell me what there is that China has to offer that Americans will buy. because we really had very little idea of how the Chinese economy worked, and there was very little that we were aware of that Americans would buy. It started out with bristles for brushes and a few silk products, and look where we are today. At that point, it really didn't, what happened in the Chinese economy really didn't matter to the U.S. because there was very little trade. And what happened in the American economy really didn't matter much to China because the interaction was so minuscule. And actually what happened in China economically didn't matter much to the world economy either. It's entirely different now. And therefore, what happens in China matters greatly to the American economy. What happens in the American economy matters greatly to the Chinese economy. And what happens in both of our economies and how we work together matters enormously to the global economy. So the dimensions of this relationship are extremely important, and these changes are really breathtaking over a period of roughly 30 years. The other point is that the business community has played, in this country particularly, but also in China, but I'll talk about this country, has played a very key role in keeping this relationship on a steadily improving basis on the economic side. There are bumps in the road over a period of time, but nonetheless, the business community has been a strong advocate. Carla really has been on the forefront of this in identifying ways in which we could broaden and deepen our relationship with China through supporting membership in the WTO when Zhu Rongji was premier, who really led the process, as Jim was of course there and very actively involved in this, but in other ways as well. There's been a lot more volatility in the political relationship than there has been in the economic relationship. But I think one of the concerns I have now, and Carla underscored this, is that notion of mutual benefit, which has really characterized the economic relationship for a long time, is now being challenged by this concern or growing mistrust in certain areas. And one of them, Carla pointed out, is the notion in China that the U.S. somehow wants to contain China's growth or contain China's rise. Let me talk about that for 1 minute and then go to the American side of the concerns. I think that there are certainly Chinese who argue this, and I watch CCTV regularly. You can get it in Washington, very good coverage. Read the Renmin Ribao in English. Or China Daily. The notion the U.S. really wants to contain China's rise economically, I regard as very puzzling when you look at the huge increase in Chinese exports to the United States. That's hardly evidence of a country that wants to contain China when you see these huge increases. There's also a lot more Chinese investment in the United States than gets publicized. What gets publicized are these CFIUS issues, but China's invested in shale production and a wide range of things, and including large state enterprises have invested here. It's not as much as American investment in China, but it's certainly growing. And anyway, the notion of trying to contain China economically makes very little sense, because it goes back to sort of this notion of a Cold War paradigm in Europe, where the Western Europeans and the U.S. together tried to contain Russia politically, although it wasn't really much of an economic power, but sort of tried to contain it politically. I don't think any of those old Cold War European Atlantic types of paradigms really apply to China. There's really no effort to contain China economically or any other way, and even if the United States wanted to, given the economic interaction between China and its neighbors, it's impossible. Very different from what was going on in Europe during the Cold War. So I would not give much credence to that argument, and I don't think there's any evidence for that argument. On the American side, there are growing concerns about one particular element, and that is the question of intellectual property, cyber piracy, cyber stealing of trade secrets. this has become a major source of mistrust. I'm concerned about it because all of us here on this panel want to strengthen U.S.-China economic ties, but this mistrust has had and is having a far greater effect. The statistics that you cited by American companies operating in China, and they are many of them are doing well, but they're worried about this. It's not so much about the trade imbalance, that does trouble people, but it's this sort of innovation nationalism, information nationalism, and a kind of mercantilism that is characterized on the part or the minds of many American companies by piracy of intellectual property, cyber stealing, things of this nature. And I think it's very important because it affects exactly the kind of things that China wants. It makes it harder for Chinese companies that want to invest here if there's a concern on the part of Americans that they have become competitive because they have taken trade secrets or intellectual property from other companies and used them to compete in the Chinese market. The same thing with high-end innovative products. If people feel that the innovation was stolen somehow, it makes other countries, not just the United States, but Europe and elsewhere, very concerned about importing a lot of these products. And particularly with respect to China's strategic emerging industries, makes a lot of American companies that might be able to sell high-end products to help China advance in those sectors reluctant to sell them for fear of losing their intellectual property, or to invest and develop partnerships with Chinese companies because of the same fear. So I think this issue, not just because the U.S. has made a big point of it, which we have and we will continue to do, but it seems to me that China, in its own interest, ought to look at some of these practices and determine whether they are in China's interest. And I think if China looks at its long-term interest, it will find that protecting intellectual property is very important to its own objectives with respect to its going-out strategy, with respect to encouraging high-end investment, and with respect to being able to sell high-technology products around the world. So those are the two areas of mistrust. Let me identify, before I close, several areas where I think there is a great potential for cooperation. And I think that while I mention intellectual property and all these concerns surrounding it, there's been a lot of progress on a whole range of economic issues. It turns out, however, that the intellectual property cyber issue is not one of them. I think that is an area where there has been some progress in certain areas like software, but there are growing concerns among American companies that new types of new methods are being used to take intellectual property, and cyber, of course, is the one that gets the most attention recently. But there are areas of cooperation. I'll just briefly touch on them. And when I was going over with Kissinger, one point Joe and I made, he said, the United States and China are two big countries, two great countries. We ought to identify important things that we focus on and do together. And in that vein, let me just identify a couple of things. One of them is environment and energy cooperation. I see enormous potential for us to work together. China has a pollution and environmental problem. When I met with the NDRC, I said, what's your most important issue at the moment? Pollution. This is a concern all over China. The United States, it turns out, has a lot of technology, a lot of companies, a lot of regulatory experience in helping to address these things, particularly in urban, as the country urbanizes. Second, shale. We have no interest at all in hurting China's ability to develop its energy sector or constraining China's growth by restricting its access to global energy markets. That gets in the papers in China on a regular basis. That is not in America's interest. We have every interest in helping China to reduce its dependence on imported energy and to strengthen clean energy in China. And we also have every interest in working with China to make sure that there's freedom of navigation in the waterways so that there's not interruption of supplies of energy. This is something where there's win-win. And we want to help the Chinese and work with the Chinese on shale, in part because it helps China reduce dependence on energy, and in part because it helps China to reduce CO2 emissions, which will be very helpful in dealing with its pollution problems. So cooperation on the environment and cooperation on shale and working together on both can be a huge project that is beneficial economically. American companies will benefit. China will benefit economically because they won't have to import as much energy. And it's, I think, the big win-win opportunity over the next several years is on environmental cooperation and shale gas cooperation. And the last point, very quickly, is, and Carla mentioned it, I think the investment issue is very important. China wants, through going out policy and having world-class companies like Haier be able to invest more abroad. American companies want fair treatment when they invest in China in a level playing field. I do think a bilateral investment treaty could be extremely important in terms of helping to address some of the concerns on both sides about investment and open up opportunities. We encourage more Chinese investment here. We have investment, as I say, in shale. A lot of investment here could create the kind of jobs that Haier is creating in the United States. This is not something that America has a negative feeling toward. And just because there are a few CFIUS issues, they get a lot of attention. The bigger issue is a very large number of Chinese companies can invest here without national security implications, we anticipate. And that would be good for China's going out strategy and good for us. These are just a couple of areas where I think we have opportunities for progress. And I would just make one other point, the localization or go local. One of the things that we are doing more and more in China is not just working with the big coastal cities, but second and third tier cities are growing very rapidly. And we want to encourage American companies to do business, trade and investment, explore investment opportunities in many of these cities. I was in Hefei and Nanjing recently. There are a lot of, Chengdu, there are a lot of cities where there are great opportunities, just as there are in the United States, for Chinese companies to invest, in Kansas City and Omaha, South Carolina, North Carolina, and many other parts of our country. We're big countries. We should have investments throughout one another's countries.
Thank you very much. We'll go to questions now, and I think the first question comes to us live from the broadcast, if I'm not mistaken. And the question is for all panelists from a Columbia University student. Please.
Hi, could you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Yeah, so talking about the healthy balance of consumption and savings in China, what suggestions do you have for China in terms of how we could reduce our current account surplus right now? We see that Chinese government has appreciated the RMB since 2005, and it has created a lot of pressure on Chinese manufacturing industries because those rely heavily on the cheap currency of RMB. So what recommendations do you have for the Chinese economy to reduce the current account surplus?
The question is if we're talking about a healthy balance of consumption and savings, how does China reduce its current account surplus? And raising our favorite currency question is one means of doing that to increase the value of the RMB. Who wants to field that one?
Well, there's no question that China has made a focus of its economic plan is to move more into consumption and less into export and heavy industry. That has enormous benefits for China. Its first 3 decades benefited hugely from exports and heavy industry, but the cost has been an enormous environmental toll and an imbalance. It has 1.3 billion people who are wise and energetic, and to move back to the consumer sector will generate small and medium-sized businesses, which are really the backbone of job creation and create a more balanced economy. I think that there are small steps moving in that direction. It's something that can't be done overnight, but it can be done gradually, and the leadership seems to be speaking in that direction. we too have an imbalance with respect to too much debt and deficit, and we need to have a decade plan, it can't be done overnight, where we make corrections. So we both have homework assignments that are on the bulletin board and should be addressed.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think Carl has put it very well. I think the rebalancing internally that the Chinese government wants to undertake can enhance the rebalancing externally for the reasons Carl mentioned. So there are a lot of things in the 12th five-year plan that if you look at them and they're accomplished by the Chinese can also improve the balance between China and the United States and address some of the concerns between our two countries. And this is certainly one, particularly as China pushes consumer power toward central and western China and puts more spending power in the hands of people in rural parts of China. That will increase demand for Chinese goods and for foreign goods, and it makes Chinese companies less reliant on exports to the rest of the world. And Carla's point also is we need to do some work at home because we're very heavily dependent on imported capital. So we need to raise our savings rate and bring our finances into balance over a period of time so we're less dependent on foreign savings. We're going to be less dependent on imported energy. That's one big plus. And we would encourage and want to help China be less dependent on foreign energy and more dependent on clean domestic energy. We're going to try to do the same thing. So there are a lot of areas where there's considerable mutual benefit, and those are the ones we ought to be enhancing.
Do we want to leave alone the question of whether the renminbi is adequately appreciated?
I'll stay away from the renminbi. That's a Treasury's Treasury's purview. I've learned over a period of time.
For Mr. Khan, from a member of the audience, how do you view the recent geopolitical frustration that Huawei faced in the U.S. market? Do you care to comment?
Recent. How do you view the frustration of Huawei in the U.S. market?
I'm not really familiar with Huawei's situation, but I would suggest this. I don't know if there are representatives from Huawei is here. If you look at Samsung very many years ago basically selling commodity goods in the United States of America. However, one of the approach Samsung in the global market is they focus on their own infrastructure. And they focus, while they're selling consumer goods at a commodity level, they focus on the semiconductor, the IC chips and whatnot. Perhaps they have the foresight. I got to give them that credit. Today they come out, you know what, they lead the market. They lead, at least from a hardware side. We Americans, we appreciate, we're fortunate we lead on the software side. But Samsung is leading on the hardware side. Did Samsung experience what Huawei experienced in terms of early on their acquisition of American business or technology? I don't know about that. But if Huawei deal with the authorities, the agencies, but just focus on your core competency, then I think the opportunity that goes along with you. So hopefully this is truly my response. I don't think I'm really addressed your concerns.
Fair enough, thank you. For Undersecretary Hormats, from a French student at Tsinghua, as China is increasingly buying oil and gas, you addressed a little bit of this earlier, as China is increasingly buying oil and gas from all over the world, the U.S. starts to produce shale in large amounts. This not only leads to jobs in the U.S. through new ports in states like Washington and production jobs in North Dakota. It helps the bilateral trade deficit and increases bilateral trade generally. Following those positive aspects, my question would be, how far do you think this trend will affect efforts to balance the consequences of climate change?
Well, it's a very good question. We're grappling with this now. Certainly, natural gas, is a better source of energy from a climate point of view, a CO2 emissions point of view. Let me make a distinction. CO2 emissions point of view, than coal by a long shot, and also by oil. So to the extent we can develop our natural gas capabilities through fracking and horizontal drilling and other new technologies, that will help us to reduce dependence on imported oil. We used to depend on foreign oil for 60% of our oil consumption. It's already down to 40%, in part because of substitutes like tight oil, which is in North Dakota and Montana, but also because of much more rigorous automobile standards, automobile emission standards. And I think those are the kind of things China also is going to have to focus on, tougher regulations on emissions. But I know China is doing this. I know there's even talk of a carbon tax in China. So there are things that can be done. But there's also the question of what you do with the methane. Methane frequently is produced as a byproduct of the process of extracting the shale gas. So you have to not just get the shale gas, but you have to deal with the methane in a way that doesn't. That also is a polluting element that has to be managed. But gas is not the ultimate answer. It is certainly a bridge fuel, a transition fuel. The ultimate answer is much greater collaboration on solar, on wind, and on nuclear power. And these don't emit CO2 gases, and over a period of time they are renewable fuels. So I think from our point of view, we can't allow, we should rejoice in the dramatic changes in shale and shale technology, and also share some of our technology. And our American companies are very prepared to do this with China, although China has a number of issues, that transparency of information, the fact that frequently to drill on shore in China, you have to have partnerships. Sometimes they're very difficult to negotiate these. In the U.S., you can just go in and drill without having a partnership. So there are a lot of things China needs to do to enhance the prospects of foreign companies coming in to drill for shale. But these kinds of things can be done. But we also need to recognize that we both all have to focus more and more on ultimate renewables. And that is that's a challenge that we need to address now. But the fruits of that effort will be 10 years, 15 years down the road. But it's the ultimate answer. Shale's a transitional answer.
Thanks. We've got time for one more question. And we've got a question from the member of the audience that I'm going to actually broaden. And because we have such a short amount of time, I'll ask everybody to answer it if you will, but keep your answers as close to a sentence or to the elevator speech as possible. For what do you think the U.S. government can do to improve the investment environment in the U.S. for Chinese companies? And let me broaden that out. What do you think can be done to improve political support here for the overall U.S.-China trade and investment relationship?
Well, I think one of the things that can be done one of the problems with Chinese investment coming in the United States is there's a tendency at the national level. When I say at the national level, a tendency of the national legislature, the Congress, to look at Chinese investments as suspicious investments, not very productive investments. Now, I think one way to overcome this, Haier is a primary example. I mean, when Haier came into South Carolina, they have made themselves good citizens there. And they provided good, clean employment. And as a result, they have a congressional delegation from South Carolina that supports Haier. Now, I'll try to be brief, but just say we need to have more Chinese companies coming into areas of the United States that are looking for job opportunities for their people. That, in turn, will develop political support from the congressional representatives from those areas. The Japanese have been very successful in doing that, and I think the Chinese can learn from that experience.
Thanks.
I do echo Mr. Sasser's opinion, and it's very well said. As Haier, we have experiences. As a matter of fact, I consider all levels of government are all supportive because this here is our common interest. We have state of Georgia visiting us about 60 days ago. We have other states, looking for business or opportunity or come forward with the opportunities. And we appreciated all that. One thing, along with the question I thought about the Huawei situation, I honestly don't know. But I want to offer to Chinese businessmen, as well as, again, the policy leaders, one thing. When you send kids to school, they go through the primary, go through the junior high, go through the high school, get to the college, how many years? There's no enterprise, no businesses that can really go into a new community and just get it like that. No, it's not going to happen. So Huawei, be patient. We hire, be patient. We do our thing, and we want to be local. And the government, the rules and whatnot, it's necessary, but it's very, very important. Set it up clearly and make it fair and equal to all, because you have people that come here before the others. You have people come later, but they are equal. Thank you.
I think we have to do a better job of educating Americans as to the benefits of having Chinese investment, and that can be done in a number of ways. At the ground level, which is an investment in the future, have exchanges. Groups like the Committee for 100 and the Common Ground, bringing people across, bringing Chinese here, business people here. I also think that Chinese businessmen and women would be well advised to focus on a state like South Carolina or California or so forth, perhaps attend the Governor's Convention or the Association of Mayors. We have delegations from both groups going to China. It would be easy to arrange business groups coming back. The mayors and the governors are very interested in investment. Their political agenda is quite different from Washington, and they would applaud it for the jobs that investment would create and for the tax revenues that they need. So I think that there are a lot of things that can be done to make it a much more attractive environment for the Chinese to come here. And it's already started. I think China last year had about $6.5 billion worth of investment. Small compared to our $60 billion in China, but that's a big jump from the $2 billion that was earlier.
Yeah, I agree with Carl. I think that the answer really is not so much in Washington, although I do think it's important to ensure that the rules are transparent and fair and well understood. But I do think that the driving forces in both trade promotion and investment encouragement are the mayors and governors. And we've tried to set up lots of programs where our governors visit China and meet with Chinese party secretaries or provincial governors, where our mayors interact and have sister city programs. Governor Jerry Brown was just out there, and he and a group met with President Xi Jinping. This is, I think, an opportunity for a far greater and deeper and broader kind of dialogue on investment. And if the state is supportive of your investment, and it doesn't have national security implications, which, as I say, only a small portion really do. But if a state governor is supportive and the state representatives are supportive and the mayors, they will have a lot of influence in Washington with their congressional delegations as well. So I think a far greater degree of interaction between our governors and Chinese provincial leaders and our mayors and Chinese mayors or party secretaries will be very helpful. And they, in turn, will have businesses in their constituencies that will want to trade with one another, will want to invest in one another's localities. And this can be very important. As I say, I think this is one, along with the energy environmental part of the relationship, this interaction between, at subnational level, is a rich, new, potentially very win-win type of a solution to a number of the problems we have, both on trade and investment, mutually beneficial.
Thank you very much. Well said. Please join me in thanking our distinguished panel. Thanks all.
Many thanks for that excellent discussion. And just to note that today, in addition to a record attendance of over 400 all throughout the day in the conference, we also have audience that are watching the live stream, and you've seen students and faculty from Nanjing in China, from the SAIS campus there, and as well as students from Columbia University in New York. So we now welcome our next speaker, and that would be Senator Bob Corker, who is the ranking member of the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations. And to introduce and to present the senator, we have a member, also the vice chairman of the Washington, D.C. region, Benjamin Wu, also one of our conference co-chairs.
Thank you, Angie. I had the distinct honor and the privilege of introducing our next speaker, Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, who is the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee. The demands of the senators in his schedule will abbreviate his appearance here today. But Senator, thank you so much for taking the time and honoring your commitment to Committee 100 in appearing before us today in this program. This is a time of significant transition in the leadership of United States foreign policy. We have changes in the executive branch down the street in Foggy Bottom. We have a new shuffling in the Secretary of State in the State Department. And also in the legislative branch, we have changes for the first time in recent memory in both the House and the Senate, in both the Republican and the Democratic leadership. And so emerging from this transition, we have Senator Corker, who has become a very thoughtful leader already and a leading voice of reason and engagement. He's using his business background and expertise on financial issues to recognize the critical intersection of economics and international relationship. And there's no greater synergy on economics and international relations than in China. Having just returned back from China earlier this month, Senator Corker is going to be taking a look at one of the most important bilateral relationships of the United States, the U.S.-China relationship. And we expect him to continue to play a leading role, and as he finds his voice on the U.S.-China relationship, the Committee 100 looks forward to engaging with you. And we thank you so much for taking the time to join us here today. So let me introduce to you Senator Bob Corker of Tennessee, the ranking member of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much. Thank you. I'm thrilled to be here. I know y'all have got a number of distinguished speakers and panels here today, and I'm glad to be here for a few moments. I will tell you, I just left a briefing where Secretary of State Kerry gave us an update on both North Korea and Syria. And the part of the world that certainly China resides in, it continues to be of great interest in many, many ways. I'll tell you, from a business person, I spent my lifetime in business. And as a candidate for the United States Senate, which is a very busy time in one's life when someone's running for public office, especially in a statewide race, I took time out in 2006 to actually travel to China and just to understand what was happening in China during that period of time with all the economic changes that were happening, because I viewed it of such great importance to our country. So again, as a candidate, being able to talk about the relationship between U.S. and China, trying to enter the United States Senate, was something that I thought was very, very important. I was just back, as was mentioned. I just was in China. We obviously have new leadership there. You have new leadership there. The world has new leadership there. South Korea has new leadership. Japan has new leadership. And so there are tremendous changes that are taking place there, and I felt it important to be back in China. Met with many leaders in Beijing. I know Gal's going to be here a little bit later at lunch. I spent some time with him there at the China Investment Corporation. But it was amazing to see the transition from the last time I was in China to today. I look at our relationship as something that ought to create greater strength for both nations. We had some legislation on the floor in the United States Senate over the last year and a half that was very oriented towards domestic consumption, trying to name China as a currency manipulator. I did not think that was a very intelligent thing to do. I thought there were other ways for us to enhance our relationship, and voted against that particular piece of legislation. But that doesn't mean that we have challenges. We do not have challenges between our two countries. I'll state one more time before I go to those challenges that I really do believe that it's in the interest of China and its citizens, it's in the interest of the United States of America and our citizens to do everything we can to foster a dynamic, intertwining relationship between our two countries. China is one of the greatest export markets, or at least future export markets, and growing now for the United States of America. And as the middle class in China continues to expand with many of the economic changes that are taking place there, should be even greater. So I think, again, our efforts here in the United States of America should be to do everything that we can to foster a positive relationship. My sense is that that's the same case with the new Chinese leadership. 3 challenges. I don't think there's any question that North Korea is problematic to both countries. There's no question that the United States of America should have had a better foreign policy approach to North Korea over the last 2 decades. There's no question that we have dropped the ball in that regard. Regardless of that, I do think that we are committed to denuclearization. I think Chinese leadership is committed to that. I do sense a greater effort towards stability in China than dealing with the North Korean issue. I think there's been some changing of attitude over the last several months. But I do think it's imperative that China play its rightful role in causing that denuclearization to take place, and that China is the only country that really has the ability to make that happen. And I hope that Chinese leadership over the course of the next short period of time will move away from such a focus on stability by turning a blind eye to much of what's happening there in North Korea. And I think the UN sanctions recently show that that is turning, and we thank the Chinese government for being involved with us in that way. But I do believe it's imperative that China do everything that it can to make sure that North Korea denuclearizes, and we look at the peninsula in a very different way. Secondly, cyber. I have to tell you, I'm a little bit appalled by some of the responses that I get when I talk to Chinese leadership about cyber. It's, all developing countries have taken technology secrets from other countries when they were developing. The United States of America did that back in the early days. That's the response. I don't think that's an appropriate response, and I do think the two countries have got to work in a very different way around the theft, the absolute theft of intellectual property. That's an issue to me that's going to continue to be a pall over our relationship, and hopefully our two countries can come to a different understanding, and candidly the world community, about the importance of ensuring that that type of theft does not take place. And then thirdly, obviously as China continues to grow and expand, which I hope continues to happen, I think that's great for the world. I think that's great for our country. Obviously an abiding of the global rules that take place in that regard need to take place. I know there's a lot of transformation. I'm on the positive side of that. I think that it is going to occur. I hope that that is going to occur because, again, I think that is great for both nations. So I will stop. I understand there are a couple of questions that may be asked. I am honored to be here. Marty Gold, a friend, has asked me to be here. I'm honored to be here. I do look at the U.S.-China relationship as probably the most important relationship right now that exists in the world. And I want to do everything I can as one United States Senator to continue to foster good relations so that both countries have the ability to improve which is our role as government officials to improve the standard of living of the citizens which we represent. And I think if we will continue an open and honest dialogue, we can make that happen. So with that, thank you for letting me say a few words. Thank you for being at this conference in the middle of our nation's capital, and I hope to work with you to further the cause that I just mentioned. Okay.
Senator, the conference is being webcast, and also we have a domestic as well as an international audience. Given the constraints on your time, we're going to forego our link to Columbia University. But we do have a question from Leah Fine, who's Executive Director for the United States Teach for China. And she asks a question regarding Stephen Schwartzman of Blackstone, who just announced a huge investment in funding Americans to study in China. And what is the role of building well-informed, linguistically and culturally fluent leaders from both nations to lead the future of bilateral relationships? And what can and should be done to ensure truly cross-cultural leadership? And what can the Senate Foreign Relations Committee do to help cultivate that?
Okay. Look, I don't think there's anything that can more strengthen individual relationships than these cultural exchanges. I think they're very important. If you look at the leadership in China right now, many in the very important roles that exist there throughout the private and public sectors and the combinations thereof, many of them have benefited from being in this country through studies or other kinds of programs and understanding a great deal about the United States. I don't think the same has happened as much between the United States and China, and I think it's very important. I look at the fact that I think all of us would like to see world peace. I just left a very disconcerting intelligence briefing regarding what is happening inside Syria right now, and I've been convinced all of my life the thing that causes more so peace to take place is there being an intertwining of economic values, of human values, and the best way for that to happen is through exchanges of the type that was just mentioned. So I'm a very strong supporter of that. I think what the United States Senate can do is continue to be a champion for those kinds of things, and most of us on the committee are. But to also figure out a way to enhance our involvement in encouraging those exchanges to take place. So I don't know exactly what Stephen has done. I do know him, and I'm glad he's making an investment in this regard. And again, I think that it's ultimately very, very important. The young people of today will be the leaders of tomorrow. And to the extent we eliminate the paranoia, the fear, the lack of understanding that can take place when two cultures really don't understand each other. To the extent we can overcome that through exchanges of this type, I think it's a good thing and something that I strongly advocate.
Well, thank you, Senator. We know that you have pressing business before you, but thank you for taking the time here today in introducing yourself to the Committee of 100 and also to our audience. And we look forward to working with you in the future.
Well, thank you. I hope that continues. I thank you very much for the opportunity to be here, and I look forward to seeing you in the future. Thank you very much.